right, ladies and gentlemen, I know that I'm about 3 minutes in. I wanted to make sure that we had some questions to go before we started. I can go ahead and start addressing everything over in the side, and I'll make sure that you guys have this after the fact as well. It'll post automatically that way. Anybody who's not able to see it, or if you want to go back and rewatch for certain things, you'll be able to access that. Currently on the side, I've got a couple of issues to deal with. We've got Vikings first. The Portuguese trading empire, Silver Mountain, Russia, China, India. As far as Russia, China, and India go, we don't actually need to cover that yet. We're starting that after the exam and working on that towards our next exam. So Russia, China, and India, you should be good. The only thing you need to be aware of for India for this test is the spice trade with Portugal. Calvinism is also something that I'll hit, Michael, and then Ali, religious reformation. Absolutely. I think Calvinism falls nicely under there, so that should work out just right. All right, let's go ahead, kick it back. Reagan, as far as the Vikings go, those were our last unit. That's post-classical. Those were part of the second wave of barbarian invasions into Europe. What they did was basically go and raid almost every civilization we've got. Their big effect was dealing with Charlemagne, kind of solidifying forces against them. And in order to protect themselves, that's where people started that feudal system. So for the Vikings, you don't need to know them for this exam, but that's just kind of a quick recap for you. Then for Portuguese trading empire in the Indian Ocean, you definitely need to be aware of it. Make sure, though, that you are focused in on the spice trade with Portugal. That was their biggest asset in the ocean. They were over there for a while until the Dutch came in and kind of took over for them. And then the Dutch were there right up until Britain came over and took over. So it kind of was a chain reaction to where each different empire loses it to another. Britain holds on to it for just a little while. For Michael, Calvinism is another kind of sect of Protestantism, and what they believe that differs from Luther is this item called predestination. Now, the concept of this being that if God is all-knowing, then he already knows when you're born whether you're going to get into heaven or whether you're not. So the idea is that you are predestined to enter heaven. You are still encouraged, of course, to act as if you were going into heaven. It's just that God already knows that you're going to act that way. So that's really its biggest key point that differs from Lutheranism. Other than that, it differs a little bit politically. Lutheranism was kind of a religion that promoted the state, whereas Calvinism came first over the state. That's why you have those wars of the Huguenots coming after French monarchists for what they're doing. For different religious reformations, we can definitely start. We've only really gone into depth over Lutheranism and kind of into Calvinism, as well as the Anglican Church. For the first Reformation, it really starts with Martin Luther. When he nails those 95 Theses to the church at Wittenberg, he changes it. He does not originally try to break free from the Catholic Church. That's why it's called the Reformation. He's trying to reform the Catholic Church to kind of get rid of all of that corruption that's been just running rampant. And what he finds is that a lot of resistance, he's met with a lot of resistance from the church and from the monarch, Charles V. Charles is not Luther's biggest fan. Originally, it seems like he's going to hear him out at the Diet of Worms, but Luther finds very quickly that that does not go in his favor. So he actually ends up fleeing to one of the electors of Saxony, Frederick. So Luther is on the run because the Catholic Church has excommunicated him, and Charles has basically kicked him out of the country. So he's faced with the choice of either giving up on his reform or continuing on, pushing onward. And that's what he chooses to do. So people who start to follow him, people who follow his tenets, among those are that you don't need a priest class, because the priests just kind of get in between the relationship you're supposed to have with God. They're just kind of a unnecessary third step, like a middleman to your salvation. That's part of it. In addition to that, Lutheranism holds the doctrine that you get into heaven through faith alone, whereas the Catholic Church, that is that you do faith and good works. That's how you get into heaven at the time. So he's basically going against what the church is saying because he can't find the justification for that in the text of the Bible. So part of it is also that he's encouraging people to read the Bible and to come up with their own ideas, their own notions from their readings, rather than to go through that third source of the priest class. So Lutheranism kind of starts off like that. At the same rough time, you also end up with Henry VIII's reform. Now, if you remember, the Church of England is a little bit different than Lutheranism. The Church of England starts off as Henry kind of taking control of the church from the Catholic Church and basically just putting himself at the head of the church in England, taking it under state control. Henry, however, did believe in a lot of the key tenets of Catholicism, so it at the beginning seems very similar, though the Anglican Church was viewed as a Protestant movement. Because of that, as we see as children push further and further, Mary was born to Catherine of Aragon from Spain, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. And then, so she was very Catholic, because if you'll remember the Reconquista, that thing that we push through Spain and reconquer it from the Muslims, kick out Muslims, kick out the Jewish faith, and that's where that Spanish Inquisition comes in. They're vehemently Catholic. So Catherine raises Mary, well, rather, her family raises Mary, going through a really tough childhood. And she's very, very Catholic. She differs from Edward and Elizabeth in that they are raised fairly Protestant. So as it goes on, the Anglican Church becomes more and more Protestant as it goes. So that is kind of the Reformation aspect of that, is that they split from the church, and then they add those extra Reformation steps to the church. Let's see. And then Calvinism, we have discussed a bit of Calvinism. It's all about Jean Calvin, who is a Frenchman who believes that the predestination, whether you get into heaven or not, is predetermined because God already knows. The big ones there, you don't need to know too terribly many of the specifics, but the big ones that we talked about were the French, the Huguenots. They're the ones who had those French wars of religion. They're the ones who were having a big problem with the Catholic Church up through Henry getting crowned as king and giving up being Protestant to become Catholic because they wouldn't have accepted him otherwise. Didn't really accept him, even though he was the one that said that Paris is worth a mass. It's worth the conversion to take control of Paris. So those are the three big reforms that we've talked about. There is also, if you recall, Russia is Eastern Orthodoxy. That comes from the Byzantine Empire. That's the other big split from the church. In addition to that, the Catholic Church itself launches a sort of counter-reformation, is what it's called, or the Catholic Reformation, where in response to Protestantism, they do try to reform certain aspects of the church. This is where we get the Jesuits, or the Society of Jesus, and this is also where we get Council of Trent, where they come together and essentially define the Pope as being in charge of the church, and he remains so because of that council. It also defines aspects of Catholicism that were originally being manipulated and kind of corrupt. It defines what they should be rather than remove the process itself. What they tried to do is define corruption and define what it actually is. So that Counter-Reformation was in response to the Protestant Reformation. I hope, Michael, that answered your question, and Ali, that answered your question. If you guys still need anything from that, please drop a comment on the side over here. Let me know, and I'll see if I can explain that any further. Lauren, the Spanish in the New World and how they treated natives compared to British and French, followed by Eggs Benedict, which is one of my absolute favorite breakfasts. I love Eggs Benedict. Russia sticks to orthodoxy even after the Peter the Great shows up. Yes, but if you recall, as we kind of started to learn a little bit today, again, you don't have to worry about that for the test. But as Peter the Great takes over, he actually tries to lessen the influence of orthodoxy. That's why he institutes that beard tax, which, I mean, you know. Lauren, going over the Spanish in the New World compared to the British and French. the Spanish in the New World were trying to convert the natives. This is one of their biggest purposes. They're expanding Catholicism in response at a certain point to the Protestant Reformation. That is why they had that encomienda system. Now, the idea of the encomienda system is kind of like a manor back in the old world. You had a central lord, somebody who was over the land, and then the natives would offer labor and convert to Christianity. And in doing so, they had to go to church. They had to follow certain religious rituals. They had to attend Mass regularly, and they had to learn Spanish. And in doing all of this and contributing labor, they were offered protection from larger tribes. Think Aztecs, those really big nations that were there. Now, the Spanish did this, and they weren't very kind to the natives. They did enforce quite a lot of hard labor, especially when you look in Peru. Those silver mines of Potosi, Hayden, that you were looking for, the silver mines are a great example of that. What happens is they find a mountain that has a lot of silver in it, very rich silver deposits. And they, through coerced native labor, were able to extract quite a lot of silver. If I remember the figure correctly, it's about 500,000 pounds of silver a year coming out of that mountain and going back to Spain. And that was done through native labor. So the encomienda system, which did that as a manorial way, and the hacienda, which gave them, I guess, a little bit of money, but not much. Those are two different ways that they coerced labor from the natives. In addition to that, the Spanish conquered two large empires, the Aztecs and the Incas. You had the Aztecs conquered by Cortez, and the Incas were conquered by Pizarro. Now, they came in, they conquered, and they reestablished rule as Spanish rule. Granted, even though they didn't treat the natives all that great, they still, especially with the Aztec Empire, they were kind of used to it, and it almost wasn't as bad. So Spain does that. Britain, if you guys recall from 8th grade, what they do with their colonies is they kind of take native land. Originally, they shared, but then started to expand once money was being made. And following the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, Britain gained territory from France all the way up through the Ohio River Valley. They gained it, and the king wouldn't let them settle, but the colonists were doing it anyway. So the natives were basically getting their land taken, so they were not very big fans of the British, and that leads to a lot of strife with the colonies down the line, and a lot of strife with the United States as it starts to expand even further westward later. And then when we look at the French, they were kind of the opposite of those two. The French had respect for the native way of life to a degree, and a lot of them would end up marrying into native life. That's because the French, the main purpose for the French being there was the fur trade. And in trapping fur, you had to kind of know where to look, and a lot of times they would end up running into tribes being with them. That's not to say that the French didn't colonize, nor to say that the French didn't farm there, but their main source was that fur trade. The French did colonize, for example, you had New Orleans, you have Acadia, which is up in Nova Scotia, and you have Haiti, Saint-Domingue. Let's see. I think that about covers what you need for those three. Also, bear in mind that each of them brought different kinds of disease from the old world, like influenza and smallpox, that led to a massive amount of death in the New World for the natives. Make sure you look into your readings over that if you don't remember, but the Great Dying was one impact of that unintentional consequence of that colonization. Calvinism, we've done that. Let me make sure that I'm hitting everything that we've got so far. Yes. Will, transatlantic slave trade in the Caribbean. If you bear in mind that the Caribbean was the place where most of the slave trade was headed, the Caribbean and through Brazil, and that was mostly due to the sugarcane plantations, which were a brutal crop to work, and a lot of death happened on those plantations. That is why it used mostly slave labor. It was rough, it was not pleasant, and malaria happened quite a lot because of the tropical regions. Also, the transatlantic slave trade was The transatlantic slave trade had kind of three big parts, that transatlantic aspect of it. The slaves would come over to create that sugar cane, which they would then use for either producing sugar or rum, trading it back to the old world. And then they would use guns to trade for new slaves. So the merchants would go all the way around these three, generally only focusing on one route. And that is how that slave trade was perpetuated. The guns would be traded to mainland African empires or factions trying to gain more power. And then they would in turn trade mostly POWs to become slaves. Those slaves would then endure something called the Middle Passage, where they crossed the Atlantic for a time of months, where most of the time they were either lying or crammed into the lower decks, every once in a while being brought up to the top to get exercise so the muscles wouldn't atrophy and make them useless once they got over. But yes, for the most part, the chattel slavery that came from that was because of and to help satisfy the labor demand for that sugarcane crop. Michael, all right, I'm glad I got your question answered, Michael. Let me know if you need anything else. Ali, the French fur trade. As far as the French fur trade is concerned, you need to know that they were there for the fur, and that's why they treated the natives well. As far as the finer details of French fur, if you're interested in that, I'm absolutely happy to talk to you about it and get you some cool sources. But I don't want you to be bogged down by that for the test. Make sure that you're focused on the effects of that fur trade instead. For Henry VIII's wives, I'll also say that was a fun topic. You do need to be aware that the first three were the ones that had children, and that's why we had a weird succession and why each of them had different religions. But what you really need to know about his wives is that that's what causes that shift in religion, and that's what continues it after. You don't need to know every single one specifically, but you go through his first wife, which was Catherine of Aragon from Spain. That was to have that alliance. Then you had, I believe, second was Catherine Parr, who, let me make sure on that. Catherine Parr, or was Parr later? Was she 4? No, she was 4. Nope, 6. Oh, wow, I'm out of order here. Catherine, this is the problem with so many Catherines. Second, okay. I don't know why I'm drawing blanks on this. There we go. Okay, so Catherine of Aragon was first. Next up was Anne Boleyn. And what Anne Boleyn is the mother of Queen Elizabeth, the third successor to the throne. She was raised by Anne's family. She became very Protestant. Then you have Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was his true love because she birthed a son. You have Anne of Cleves, who was made as a political alliance with the Duke of Cleves. And that didn't last long because Henry claimed that she was ugly and didn't really want anything to do with that. Catherine Howard is next, and she got beheaded for cheating on him. And then finally, you have Catherine Parr, who survived him. But you don't need to be too well-versed with what each one of those was like and why they died or did not. Just kind of be aware of the secession, and why that's important is really because the Church of England's split from the Catholic Church is intensified by that. Let's see. Casabe, I think. Casabe? Do we need to know about the Mi'ah system along with the encomienda system? You do need to be aware of the encomienda system, and the Mi'ah system kind of transfers over to the Potosi mines. Just to kind of explain that out, the Mi'ah system that the Inca had, the Spanish took on that aspect of the Inca after they conquered them. That's how they enforced the natives' need, that they coerced the labor using the old Mi'ah system. As far as the encomienda system, it's kind of like that manorial system. I explained it a little bit earlier. So after the video, if you want to kind of rewind and check that out, that would be the best way to do that. Then there are motives for colonization on the test, not just colonization, but exploration and trade themselves. Remember, there's the scientific boom that's happening, the Renaissance is happening, and people, turns out, really don't like bland food after you've had it spiced. So what they start doing is they start trying to find a new way to trade with Asia because that land route has been cut off by the Ottomans. Mercantilism, you do need to have a working knowledge of, even if not for this test. The idea being that it's a zero-sum game. There's only so much wealth in the world. And if there's so much wealth in the world, then you need to be able to concentrate it all in your country. So you need a positive gain from it. The way that different mother countries would do this is that their colonies would be trading them raw materials and foodstuffs. The country would then either trade that out to other countries with a markup, or they would manufacture goods using the putting out system, where they put the labor out to different countrysides to manufacture these goods before industrialization. And they would take that, manufacture the goods, and sell those. And that is also at a markup. So the idea being that if England, for example, had more silver coming in from France because they were trading more English-made goods, then France was losing money, meaning that, again, it's a zero-sum game. So if one gains wealth, the other has to lose it. Economically speaking, that kind of up in the air now. You can't really say that because mercantilism ends with the idea of the free market economy in Adam Smith, which we'll talk about that part of it a little bit later. Eggs. Henry was a cat person opposed to a dog person. I'm not sure. Oh, okay. Yes. Eggs. Yes. I now know who Eggs Benedict is too. I'm pretty sure. Come talk to me tomorrow, and I'm pretty sure I know exactly who you are. All right, Michael. On the transatlantic slave trade routes, I saw slaves coming from Africa to North America. I was wondering how the slaves got from Africa to North America. Europeans did go to Africa and then to North America. These merchants, what they would do, as we talked a little bit earlier about that middle passage, what the merchants would do is they would trade the guns to African, I guess you could call them states or empires or different factions in Africa trying to gain more power for prisoners of war. Then take those prisoners of war or other slaves and put them into a ship and then carry them across the Atlantic. That, again, was referred to as the Middle Passage and was probably one of the most brutal aspects of slave trade. Probably isn't on the test. And Michael, if that's not enough of an explanation, I'm happy to sit down with you and kind of show you some extra stuff about it. They do go over there, though, on those ships, and there are a lot of accounts of the Middle Passage, and it's rough. So I'm absolutely happy. Come on by anytime, and we'll chat about it. Will, 30 Years' War. 30 Years' War was an effect of the Protestant Reformation on the Holy Roman Empire, and pretty much all of Europe kind of gets sucked into this 30 Years' War. And it pits the Protestants against Catholics. If you'll remember, this all starts with the defenestration of Prague, and you don't need to know that aspect of it. You do need to know its kind of effects. First, it takes away the power of the Holy Roman Emperor. This is where we start to see the Holy Roman Empire keep shrinking, and this is where we see Prussia come into the picture, and Austria and Hungary kind of really start to gain more and more power. What this does is it solidifies power in certain nation states, and we're going to start to see after this test, we're going to start talking about the absolutists and how that kind of took form afterwards. But the idea is the 30 Years' War was a war between Catholics and Protestants and ended with kind of a stalemate. Everybody lost the 30 Years' War and nobody won it. In fact, 8 million people die in this war. It's a rough war of religion, and this just is a highlight of how rough things were after the Protestant Reformation. They didn't view religion as a choice. They viewed religion as fact. And so when somebody's wrong, you're not trying to just prove yourself right. You're trying to, in kind of a way, save them from themselves. So Protestants and Catholics at this point are in supreme hatred of each other. And it takes a long time for Europe to get to the point where Protestants and Catholics just tolerate each other's existence, much less accept each other. And the 30 Years' War is an excellent indicator of that. Michael, it's one of the most rough things that we can talk about this year. It wasn't just the fact that they're going across the ocean, but they were also sardined in those ships. They were forced to either lie down or sit very close to each other. The idea being packing as many slaves as you could on one voyage. So it was not a comfortable voyage for about 3+ months. Types of developments and technologies do we need to know? You need to be aware, especially of the ships. The ships are the big ones. Also your astrolabe, your sextant, both of those being navigational tools, and your magnetic compass that we talked about last time. Your big ships you need to know here are your flute, your caravel, and your carrack. The three of them, all three of them, though they have different aspects, had the same concept. They were bigger ships that were able to sail quickly, that were able to follow the new wind patterns that they were becoming more and more aware of. And most importantly, they had a very big capacity for trading goods. That is what makes these ships worth the travel, because before that, it was too far to make it profitable. But these new big ships that were made especially for trade, now it becomes profitable. Treatment of Aztecs by Spaniards, specifically the Aztecs. Well, first, the Spaniards conquered them, and it was conquering using the surrounding areas, the surrounding peoples from the Aztecs, that the Aztecs had conquered. They weren't the Aztecs' biggest fan. The Aztecs demanded sacrifices. It kept these smaller nations constantly at war in order to appease the Aztecs. So a lot of them, whenever Cortez does come by, were willing to join Cortez in trying to overthrow the Aztecs. So here you see the death of King Moctezuma, which ends Cortez's welcome in Tenochtitlan. Because of that, Cortez circles back, Cortez's men, and he circle back, and they gather a big force, and they lay siege to Tenochtitlan. That's that city right in the middle of the lake, the Aztec capital. They lay siege to it for 80 days, and it looked for a while like the Aztecs might actually win. But the Spaniards had two big advantages. They have smallpox, and they have guns. The guns helped to fight them, and the smallpox, that really helped to bust that siege, because once smallpox entered that city, it decimated the population. It was a brutal end to an empire that only lasted about 100 years, and it was not kind the way that they ended it either. That was not, I don't think, an intentional weapon. They didn't weaponize smallpox intentionally, but it was a happenstance that ended up really working in the Spaniards' favor. Columbian Exchange and Atlantic System. The Atlantic System, you mostly need to be aware of that transatlantic slave trade, but also be aware that goods are being transported across. Your Columbian Exchange is more biological in nature. You're looking at how different crops were traded and their impact. So, for example, a lot of crops from the Americas could grow in Europe on soil that previously was unable to be utilized for crops. Things like potatoes and tomatoes had the ability to grow where wheat just didn't. So now, with all of these new items being grown in Europe, it supplements their diet, and it actually leads to an increase in nutrition for everybody. That itself is going to lead to a population boom in Europe, a very big one. It almost from here on out, we're going to start to see kind of a J curve of population, to where the further down the line we go, the more and more people. And we're going to start to see that this is really one of the key starting points of that. So the Columbian Exchange is all about those exchange of different biological items. So your big ones from the Americas, you've got tomatoes, because without that, Italian food would not exist the way it currently does. You have honeybees coming over from the Old World. Sugarcane would be one of the big ones from the Old World, because it led to that plantation system. And then you'll also see, because of this biological exchange in the New World, it had a very negative effect. You see a lot of new diseases come over, like the flu and smallpox, which the natives had no immune system for. They weren't pastoral. The only things that they had domesticated was the llama. The only beast of burden they had domesticated was the llama. So you don't see them living among the animals like in the Old World they used to. And that's where a lot of these diseases would come from. So they had no immune system built up to them, so it just completely decimates their population. In addition to that, though, it changes the native lifestyle, for example, of the horse. It completely shifts the way that Plains Indians lived. Now they can hunt the buffalo. Now they can move. They can become more nomadic. And it really turns some tribes into forces to be reckoned with, the access to these European horses. Other things that were transported on the Columbian Exchange, the other direction there was from the Americas to the Old World, syphilis. And this is going to indirectly cause a lot of social strife to rise up to a boiling point. And that's due to infertility from the disease. How much do we need to know the Americas before Europeans show up? You need to know all of the big ones that we've talked about, but those are ones that we've discussed way back. We're talking the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca. Those are the big three. The two that were around when the Spaniards showed were the Aztecs and the Inca. We haven't really talked too much about the Northern American societies yet. We'll talk about them more in the relation to the colonies up there. As far as the ones before that, you'll need to, and this is for the AP exam, you'll need to know the Olmecs, the Toltecs, and it'd be nice to have a working knowledge of the Mound people as well. Will, for voodoo. Voodoo was one of those big syncretic religions. It syncretizes a lot of old world animism, mostly from Africa, and that syncretizes with the French idea of Roman Catholicism. So the Creoles that were there, that Creole French comes from this time in Haiti, and it's basically French with a very thick accent, a lot of different words. The spelling's a little bit different, pronunciation is vastly different, but it has its roots in French, that Creole language. So what voodoo does is it has a lot of remarkably similar characteristics to Catholicism. You've got your one God, you've got your saints. And so on the surface, the French thought that the slaves were following their religion. However, upon closer inspection, voodoo has a lot of things that are just a little bit different. For example, instead of having just one God, they also have a Parthenon of what we call loa, or spirits. And these loa each serve a different purpose. The whole concept of a syncretic religion is that it takes aspects from several different ones and melds them all together. And voodoo is a perfect example of that in Haiti. Pronounce the name, Benjamin, I'm so sorry. I'm going to try. Please don't make fun of me too much. Tenochtitlan. I probably butchered that, and I apologize. Gabe. República de Indios, that is the Spaniard belief that the Indians who were not taking part in the Mid-A system, sorry, not the Mid-A, yeah, well, the Mid-A system, nor taking part in the Encomienda Hacienda system. The República de Indios is the Indians that were not part of the Spanish Empire. So they had their own thing going, their own religion, their own political structure. And as far as countries were Catholic and Protestant, your big Catholic countries were Spain. And again, that was the Reconquista as a big indicator of their Catholicism. After the Reconquista, the Spanish Inquisition really made sure that they stayed Catholic. France was mostly Catholic. It did have some problems with identity there because you do have those wars of religion. And the Huguenots continue to be a source of friction all the way up through Louis XIV. So they're mostly Catholic with Protestant in there. Then you have in England, mostly Protestant, but their rulers, once we get to James, become more Catholic. So you'll start to see a little bit of strife go on there all the way up until we get the Glorious Revolution in our next unit. Or sorry, not Glorious, the English Revolution in our next unit. And then for the Holy Roman Empire, they're going to be split Catholic-Protestant, mostly Catholic in the south, mostly Protestant in the north. Russia and Prussia, Prussia becomes more Protestant. Russia is Eastern Orthodoxy. So you kind of start to see, as you get further away from Italy, further away from Rome, that's where we start to see the different Protestant religions becoming more and more influential. Finland, Norway, those are all mostly Lutheran. Scotland is Calvinist. Scotland has Calvinism in it, but is ruled by Catholic. The Wars of Independence in Scotland, we aren't going to go too far into that, Will. However, if you're interested in that, there's always AP Euro. We do go a lot further in depth with everything in AP Euro as far as that's concerned. SAQ structure, remember to ace everything. You answer the question, cite it, and explain it. You can do this in one paragraph if you do it right, even if there are 3 different points. Generally, all of it deals with the same topic, so make sure that you guys are addressing each one of them. All that you need for the point there is to have an answer, to have a piece of evidence, and to be able to explain that evidence. If you don't explain the evidence, you're just saying like a one-word answer. You're not really getting it done. So make sure that you do exactly what the question is asking you, and you'll be fine. Remember, it's about 13 minutes that we're going to have on this. So when you get to the question, you need to have your examples ready to roll. Almost as soon as you read it, you need to start thinking, okay, what are some examples? How can I explain that to make it fit this question? Yeah, ace, Benjamin, you are 100% correct. Gabe, The Reconquista, where the Spaniards conquered Aztec and Incas. No, Gabe, the Reconquista is where the Spaniards reconquer. That's the Reconquista is the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula, of Spain. And now it wasn't that Spain reconquered Spain. It was that Catholics reconquered Spain. Spanish would be, or Spain would be what we call it after some time, but during the Reconquista, it was still two separate kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. I hope that helps. All right, guys, I'm going to leave the floor open for a few more questions, but we need to start thinking about wrapping up. So make sure if you've got anything left on your mind, drop it over in the comment section here, and I'll try to address it as best as I can. I'll wait for about 2 or 3 more minutes. Michael, yes, the tension between Catholics and Muslims did cause the Reconquista in a way. Keep in mind that with the Reconquista, it's all about that friction that's left over from the Crusades. So that friction has been there for quite some time. The Reconquista is more about reunifying Europe. They felt like part of Europe was not really European, because remember, everything that held them together, it wasn't geography, it wasn't language, it was religion. And Spain was the Iberian Peninsula, sorry, Spain and later Portugal, they were the only part of Europe that was not what was considered European. So they wanted it back. It was this war of religion. So it was definitely tension between Catholicism and the Muslims that were there, the Moors. Ottomans are important, Ben, but they are not for this test. We're going to cover them with land-based empires starting on Thursday. 4-day weeks mess me up. Starting on tomorrow's Thursday. Yeah, Thursday. Cool, bros. You did miss it, but that's okay because it posts automatically when I'm done, so you'll be able to go back and watch the whole thing if you want. Colin, the big difference between the Catholic and Protestant religions, well, we've got a couple. That one's actually boils down to quite a lot. The Catholics believe that the Pope is the head of the church. This was reaffirmed with that Council of Trent. Protestants do not believe that. Protestants have, especially Lutheran Calvinists, they have less importance attributed to your relationship with the clergy and more devoted to your relationship with God. The idea being that good works aren't going to get you into heaven. Your faith is going to get you into heaven. And what you need to be doing is reading the Bible to make your own conclusions about that. So Protestantism is more individual, whereas Catholicism is more kind of ritual-based. They follow certain steps. Other big differences, Catholicism has this belief called transubstantiation, which is where the Eucharist, body and blood of Christ, is mysteriously turned into the body and blood of Christ. It's not symbolic. Whereas in Protestant faith, it's subsubstantiation, which is symbolic. That is probably more in depth than we need to go on that, but we will go further in European history. But for world history, you do need to know that Protestantism rejects the Pope and the clergy as powerful in that sense. There's no one unified leader. There's no God's will or word on earth coming from one man. So that would be the biggest one that I would say that you should focus on. Will, how were the economics of the Caribbean and Brazil affected by slave trade? Economics boomed. Their farms, their plantations were putting out a lot of sugarcane, and it was so profitable that it continued to increase in trade all the way up through 1800. Like, it takes a long time for that slave trade to vanish. Ben, Treaty of Tordesillas. I can't do this word. I don't know why I can't do this word. Treaty of Tordesillas. Treaty of Tordesillas is a treaty between Spain and Portugal. Portugal basically gets anything new found from put a line down the middle of the map and say anything on this side of it is Portugal, anything on this side is Spain. So anything new discovered becomes Spain's in the New World. And so Spain gets a lot more land than originally anticipated from this deal. Portugal got a lot in the Old World, so they were more focused on that Indian Ocean spice trade until the Dutch kind of steal it from them. All right. Any further questions, guys? Last call for questions. If you don't have them dropped up in the next minute or two, I'm going to go ahead and cut off questions. Podcasts. Ben, I'm sorry, I saw that and completely forgot to address it. For the podcast, I'm going to be looking through the form. And what I'm going to try and do here is I'm going to have individual conversations with y'all. And I'm going to tell you kind of the direction that I'd like you to take to make sure that you're prepared. What we're basically going to do is I'm going to have 3 to 5 of y'all come in at a time. We're going to sit down and have like a 10, 15-minute conversation tops, or maybe like a 5 to 10-minute conversation tops about said topics. And we're just going to kind of have a chat, go a little bit into depth. That way you guys have something to think about or something to listen to if you're having a hard time with an issue. Will, my dog is a mutt, but she looks like a shepherd. Gabe, could you go over the mestizos, peninsulares, and creoles? Yes, absolutely. So that's part of that Spanish casta system, the new caste system they put into place in the New World. This is very similar to the caste system placed by the Aryans whenever they went into India. So you can relate this very well to the Hindu faith, in which you have very clearly defined very clearly defined social roles. So at the very top, you have the peninsulares. These are the guys that come from the Iberian Peninsula. So you're Spaniards or you're Portuguese. So you're coming directly from there. You're at the top of the pyramid. Below them, you have your Creoles, which were born in the New World. They are viewed as less than the Peninsulares. And then even below them, this is where we start to get into those new ethnicities being formed. Below them, you've got your mestizos, which is a mix between natives and peninsulares or Creoles. Then below them, you have your mulattoes, which are a mix between peninsulares and Creoles and slaves. And then at the very bottom of that pyramid are your slaves. So the concept being that if society has its own structure, then everybody kind of stays in their place. And it reformats using these new ethnicities to kind of place that social hierarchy on the New World. All right, guys. Well, barring any last-minute questions, I'm going to go ahead and start signing off here. I appreciate all of you putting the extra time in to make sure you guys are prepared for tomorrow. I know that there are things that you would rather be doing at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I do get it. And I do appreciate that you guys are putting this much effort in. I know it's going to help you guys out tomorrow. Remember, it's 20 questions long, multiple choice. Focus on the prize. Read your questions first. Remember, it is a time test, so read your questions first and then go looking for the answer if you need to. A lot of times you guys are going to be able to figure the answer out before you even look at the stimulus. So make sure you guys are focused in. Make sure you guys are looking at it, cool, clear head. Get a lot of sleep tonight. Do not stay up until midnight or further studying. You know who you are. Following that, also make sure you eat a good breakfast even if you don't like breakfast. It's important. It helps you keep your brain sharp. Don't drink more than a cup of coffee because then you guys act crazy pants. Other than that, guys, I hope y'all have a great evening. Spend just a little bit of time working on this, but you don't need to spend too much more. I know that you guys have been listening. I know you guys have been working through this. And thank you guys one more time for putting in that extra effort. I appreciate it. All right. Woodrow signing off.